Great Depression is by far the worst economic catastrophe of the 20th century and, perhaps, the worst in U.S. history. Between 1929 and 1933, the unemployment rate soared to 25% of the labor force, the stock market lost almost 90% of its value, and some 7,000 banks failed. Many families went hungry, and few could afford to own a car. Great Depression dramatically changed the role of government, especially the federal government. Before the Great Depression, federal government spending accounted for less than 3% of GDP. By 1939, federal outlays exceeded 10% of GDP. When the Great Depression is mentioned, the first thing that likely comes to mind is the massive stock market crash of 1929. While the starting panic was indeed memorable, it was just one aspect of the overall impact of the Great Depression. At the start of 1929, due to concerns about market speculation, the Fed Reserve sold securities, leading to a halt in bank credit expansion, while the discount rate was raised to 6% in August. Commercial paper rates also rose to 6%, with call rates peaking at 20%. As early as June, business activity began to recede, and by July, commodity prices began their descent. The stock market reached its high on September 19 and then, slowly began to decline. For 5 more weeks the public nevertheless bought heavily on the way down. Some financial leaders continued to be optimistic on stock market, including Charles E. Mitchell, the president of the National City Bank. In October, Mitchell and a coalition of bankers attempted to restore confidence by publicly purchasing blocks of shares at high prices. The effort failed. Investors began selling madly. Within a few weeks, the stock market dropped 40%. The stock market crash of October 1929 made it more difficult for many businesses to repay their loans to the banks, and many banks found their balance sheets impaired as a result. In response to the crash, the New York Fed took controversial actions that relaxed the reserve constraint faced by banks in New York City, enabling them to remain open during the crisis. These actions helped contain the crisis in the short run, and within a few months, the Dow Jones Index rallied 30% from its 1929 low. As former President Reagan once said, "The most terrifying words in the English language are, 'I'm from the government, and I'm here to help.'" This time there was no difference. The government came to help. In June 1930, the U.S. government passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, the most protectionist legislation in U.S. history. The act raised American tariffs to unprecedented levels. Officials believed that raising trade barriers would force Americans to buy more goods made at home, which would solve the unemployment problem. Foreign governments soon retaliated with trade barriers of their own. American agriculture lost nearly a third of their markets. Farm prices plummeted and tens of thousands of farmers went bankrupt. This was responsible for widespread agricultural bank failures, which then led to contagion effects. Smoot-Hawley placed enormous pressure on the central banking system and capital structure. Due to the uncertainty of trade conditions, each of the 10 largest world economies had their financial markets crash. It created international financial chaos. In Germany, faced with hyperinflation and soaring unemployment, people sought refuge in a movement that promoted national pride, and signed up to Hitler's National Socialist German Workers' Party, known as Nazi. On December 11, 1930, the 4th largest bank in New York City, Bank of United States, collapsed. The troubles of Bank of United States began shortly after it entered a vigorous period of expansion. For many months its deposits have fallen. Conservative Manhattan bankers were angry at Bernard K. Marcus, the president of Bank of United States. His ambition was perhaps much too high. In 1929, he stated, "Often we've put 2 or 3 days' work into one. We have gone ahead 2 or 3 times as fast as we would have, had we been working only 1 day at a time." To bankers, a day's work is a day's work, to be done well, thoroughly. Before the bank collapse, the state was busy investigating reports that the bank had sold stock to depositors at $198 a share, promised repurchase in the event of a decline, an illegal banking act. Despite its impressive size, grandiose name and number of depositors, no other financial institution stepped up to bail it out. The Fed also did not want to be seen as bailing out a bank that had engaged in risky practices. The Bank of United States failure ignited a banking crisis that led to the Great Money Hoard, setting in motion the Great Depression, in which millions of Americans lose their jobs. In 1930, the U.S. economy was not doing well, but unemployment was only at 9%. Banking panics were regional. However, the situation changed in the fall of 1931, and the commercial banking crisis spread nationwide. On September 21, 1931, Great Britain left the gold standard, that is, withdrew its promise to provide a specific amount of gold in exchange for its banknotes. Foreigners became concerned the United States would do the same and began converting their dollar assets to gold. This external drain caused a large reduction in the U.S. gold supply. At the same time, depositors became concerned about the safety of banks and withdrew currency from their accounts, creating an internal drain on the banking system. Together, these external and internal drains reduced the money supply, deepening the deflation which propagated the Depression. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York responded to the external drain in the gold stock by raising its discount rate and acceptance buying rate in early October. The goal was to encourage investors to deposit money in the United States by providing a relatively high yield on U.S. financial assets. According to Friedman and Schwartz, the internal drain wouldn't have been so severe if the Fed had increased open market purchases as well. Although the external drain on the U.S. gold stock ended by late October, bank failures continued. To try to relieve the strain in the banking system, in January 1932, the U.S. Congress created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, RFC, which had the authority to lend to banks, other financial institutions, and railroads. In addition, the Fed began a program of large-scale open market purchases in April 1932. By the time the program had ended in August, the Fed had purchased about $1 billion in government securities. The bank failure epidemic ended and stock market rallied strongly. Economic conditions improved by the summer of 1932, but relief did not last. In early 1933, a national panic arose. Many factors contributed to the national banking panic, including uncertainty over the economic policies of President Roosevelt. Banks could have borrowed from the RFC but were reluctant to do so, in part because their names would be published and their action might be seen as a sign of weakness, which might then lead to a run on the bank. Fears that Roosevelt would devalue the currency led private banks and others with dollar assets to accumulate foreign currencies. The Fed once again was concerned about a potential drain of the U.S. gold stock. The Fed again raised discount rates and acceptance buying rates in February 1933, as it had during the fall of 1931, to help slow the drain on gold reserves. Interest rates rose across the board. But once again, the Fed did not increase its open market purchases significantly. Rather than containing the panic, the system itself shared in the panic that prevailed in New York, and even the Federal Reserve banks were closed on March 4. As a result of thousands of bank failures, the U.S. money supply dropped 29% from 1929 to 1933 and stock market dropped another 80%. On April 5, 1933, Roosevelt ordered all gold coins and gold certificates in denominations of more than $100 turned in for other money. It required all persons to deliver all gold coin, gold bullion and gold certificates owned by them to the Federal Reserve by May 1 for the set price of $20.67 per ounce. By May 10, the government had taken in $300 million of gold coin and $470 million of gold certificates. In 1934, the government price of gold was increased to $35 per ounce, effectively increasing the Federal Reserve's balance sheets by 69%. This increase in assets allowed the Federal Reserve to further inflate the money supply. While the Depression had passed its peak, the history of America was still unfolding.